Jenny Smith, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about whether or not you should ban or not ban cell phones in the classroom. It's a big question, one that we get asked on the seminary Facebook group a lot, and I'm super excited to talk to you about it. I think you're going to hear lots of things that you haven't heard before, so go ahead and listen to the end so you can hear all the statistics and find out some ideas on how to create your own cell phone policy that will work in your classroom. Now, almost exactly 100 years ago, my great-grandmother was a brand new school teacher in a one-room log schoolhouse just a mile from where I'm sitting right now. The building wasn't in as good a shape as you see it here in the picture. It's since been covered with siding and has been used currently by the Ruritan Club as a community building. Back then, the walls were so poor that the students would bring their dogs, leave them outside the building, and feed them through the gaps between the logs. Students in the area were poor. My grandmother was a young teacher, bringing new skills and new ideas. My great-grandmother caused a near riot in the community when she asked parents to send their students to school with something new, a notebook. Now, at the time, all students were using slates. Notebooks were new technology in Stafford County. They were expensive and not reusable. Parents couldn't see the value in buying expensive notebooks. After all, they had used slates and turned out just fine. But notebooks allowed students to do a greater volume of work and to keep their work for review. The community knew there were benefits to using notebooks, but since they were raised using slates, they were unsure how to actually use the new tool, or if this was just another gimmick that would soon pass. Today, we'd never think of a notebook as being innovative or new or to be resisted. However, 100 years ago, they were. Now, I tell this story to make the point that teachers need to view the problem of new classroom technology through a historical lens. Unstructured personal technology use is not the first classroom distraction, nor will it be the last. We are living in a time of transition, just like in my great-grandmother's day. We know there are benefits to using cell phones in the classroom, but we're unsure how to manage them. You and I are in the awkward stage where we're trying to teach with a tool that we didn't grow up with. It's not easy. But my research over the past few months makes me believe that cell phones can be successfully managed in the classroom with a little training. Management may include a permanent or temporary cell phone ban. It may mean that you need to develop some new skills so you can incorporate cell phones so seamlessly that they're a part of the classroom in the same way a desk or a notebook or a pencil is. But before we talk about how cell phones may be integrated in today's classroom, let's take a few minutes to discuss the current classroom situation relating to cell phones. Follow along as I read these two examples aloud and see if these experiences seem familiar to you. The first is from Professor Duns, who is an assistant professor of theology at Marquette University. Now listen to his words as he describes the situation in his classroom. Things reached a breaking point last November. I was leading a classroom discussion on the theological dimensions of Martin Luther King Jr.'s works. Much of the class listened with rapt attention. Many nodded. One noted that today's social media works to fan outrage and anger but does not often offer constructive solutions. And for a moment, I felt they saw why a course in theology is essential to their education. My excitement was shattered when I turned and saw one student on his laptop looking at shoes for sale online, and another, head turned down, texting frantically on his cell phone. I could have kept my focus on those who were showing enthusiasm, but I surrendered control to two students who quite probably had no sense of the impact they were having. Without singling them out directly, I stopped and made a snarky comment on how some people risk their lives for civil rights and others think shopping and texting are more important. They both registered that I was addressing them and turned away from their devices. It was a Pyrrhic victory, though, because I could sense that I had lost them for the rest of the term. Does this sound familiar? Instructors and the seminary teachers of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Facebook group expressed frustration similar to Professor Dunn's. On July 2nd, 2019, Catherine P. posted, "I said no cell phones, but they kept sneaking them. One girl in particular refused to put it away and openly defied me when I asked. Another girl cried because she was worried she'd miss an emergency from home. I hated them and the struggle was so intense that when I tried to fight the kids on it, the spirit was thin during class. Is there anyone out there that successfully conquered this issue? I failed miserably last year, and this year I want to succeed. I can relate to Catherine. Probably you can too. It sounds familiar. The situation is dire. Consider the following information from research into college-age students. Now, these studies are going to talk about college students, but note that many of these respondents were the same age as the students in your seminary class just a year or so prior to participating in the study. So I think these results are pretty relevant to what's going on in the seminary classroom. During a 2015 study of 400 college students, respondents reported that they use their cell phone at least once per class, and that students generally believe this to be an acceptable practice. During a 2019 study of medical students in India, 12% stated that they wanted to use mobile phones in the class, even if it affected their learning in class. 53% used their cell phone during class 21 to 30 times each day, and 12% reported more frequent use during class. 22% claimed their need to use mobile phones outweighed the importance of learning. Researchers concluded, quote, students consider it as their right to use these devices, and they believe that this right outweighs the distraction caused in learning. Another large U.S. study showed that a majority of students believe cell phone use is always appropriate in the classroom. But in the same study, researchers found that 90% of instructors felt cellular phone use was never appropriate. Are you freaked out a little bit? Well, I am. Students and instructors disagree on some very fundamental issues related to cell phones and their place in the classroom. Trying to enforce a cell phone policy can leave teachers exhausted and frustrated like Catherine P., or lead them to lash out like Professor Duns and lose students for the rest of the term. Now, I think our natural reaction is to eliminate the problem, to ban phones outright. And that's a reasonable response. You're tired of feeling like the Hulk, and you decide that it's easy to go banner. Ha ha ha, okay, do you see what I did there? Yeah, it's a little cheesy, okay? But you get the idea. It takes strength to allow phones in the classroom. And when students break the rules, it leaves us feeling angry. We imagine we'll feel more successful if we can ban cell phones and that we'll find peace again when we don't have to worry about cell phones. And you probably will. Banner seems like the safe bet. Hulking it or allowing phones seems dangerous. And it is. The decision to go banner or Hulk is especially difficult at church. A math teacher may ban phones with little effect on learning. In fact, it may help students to learn how to find math solutions on paper. But we know our gospel students need to learn the Gospel Library app in order to prepare for a mission and beyond. The church is putting more and more materials out digitally. In fact, many, like the newly reworked General Handbook, will never be put on physical media at all. Cell phones as a tool for sharing and learning the gospel aren't going away anytime soon. They just aren't. How can a teacher resolve these conflicts? Here, a gospel teacher has some advantages over a secular teacher because of the learning domain we emphasize in the gospel classroom. I'm talking about affective versus cognitive learning here. Since 1956, educators have identified 3 types of educational activities called learning domains. The 3 domains are cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. So the domains the seminary teacher is primarily concerned with is cognitive and affective domains. Now, cognitive learning is the kind with which you're most familiar. It deals with the acquisition of knowledge and development of mental skills. Think about memorizing facts, lists, or formulas. In seminary, it's memorizing doctrinal mastery passages or learning about the gospel, the doctrinal mastery topics to prepare for the seminary exam. The goal is often to pass a final exam where the student shows mastery of these intellectual skills. Now, affective learning is the type primarily concerned with the growth of feelings and emotions. The goals of effective teaching are usually to help students develop right attitudes and pro-social values. In a secular classroom, the emphasis is mostly on cognitive learning. Secular teachers are trying to fill a student's heads with lists or formulas that will give them the right information to pass a test. Teachers may work on affective learning with a class, but it's not the primary emphasis of secular education. In a gospel classroom, however, our goals are quite different. We're not trying to fill brains with lists of data. We aren't memorizing birthdays of the apostles or performing math problems using the Nephite system of weights and measures. We are focused on helping students recognize that spirit which leadeth to do good and follow its promptings. The gospel teacher's prime focus is on effective learning, or learning that deals with feelings and behaviors, not facts. In other words, we don't want to make little churchy robots who can regurgitate information or quote the entire Bible word for word. We want to grow adults who can live happily with themselves and others, confident before God. We know that our youth will grow up in a world that sometimes does not have easy answers, that sometimes the formulas won't work. We want to create individuals who can get through these difficult times triumphantly. We don't want to create people who can talk about the world. We want to nurture people who can change it. Now back to our main topic, cell phones. Most of the negative reports you hear about cell phones in the classroom are based on research performed in secular classrooms. And they relate to cognitive learning outcomes, especially as relates to distraction. It's clear from almost a decade of research that the presence of cell phones affects cognitive learning outcomes negatively. This may surprise you, but cellular phone policies have been shown to positively influence affective learning outcomes, which are exactly the kind of outcomes we're seeking in the gospel classroom. Now, think back to your study of the Ten Commandments. Do you remember that some of the commandments begin with thou shalt and others with thou shalt not? They're basically do's and do nots. Well, it turns out that research shows the way you phrase your cell phone policy matters. The tone of a policy influences student effective learning, or the type of learning that deals with feelings and values. So when setting a cell phone policy, we have a choice whether to create a policy that's encouraging, a thou shalt policy, or a policy that's negative, a thou shalt not policy. A thou shalt policy might say something like, bring your cell phones to class to be used for class-related activities. Compare it to this thou shalt not policy that does the same thing, but with a different tone. Students may not use cell phones for any purpose outside of class. Now, let's look at a couple of images that might be thou shalts or thou shalt nots. Tone matters in art, and it matters in how you frame your cell phone policy. This should not surprise you, but students prefer encouraging policies, the thou shalt kind of policy. However, as long as the policy is perceived as fair and reasonable, a thou shalt not policy can be accepted. It's all about student perception of your intent and tone. So when you're thinking about banning a cell phone, let me take a break here from my notes and just note here that we're talking about you can either ban or not ban. But what you need to do is think about how the tone that you're using when you express your policy affects students. Using this information that I'm giving you, you'll be able to make decisions about how you express your decision to either go banner or hulk it with your seminary cell phone policy. All right, continuing on. Policies that encourage technology for educational purposes were associated with positive perceptions of the instructor's credibility, and a mixed technology policy, which discouraged non-academic use of technology while allowing technology to be used for academic purposes, did not significantly impair instructor ratings. So what's the translation of that? It means that policies that encouraged cell phones for on-task purposes made students think more highly of instructors. Other technology policies that discouraged off-task use but allowed on-task use did not damage instructor ratings. Note that thou shalt not policy didn't increase instructor ratings, but it didn't damage them either. So what do we learn from this? Policies that include an allowance for on-task cellular phone use are preferred by students. Another study showed that instructors who included encouraging policies in their syllabi would be perceived as more caring than instructors who included discouraging policies. And instructors who included encouraging policies would be perceived as more trustworthy than instructors who included discouraging policies. And specifically, encouraging policies appear to result in greater perceptions of instructor caring, competence, and trustworthiness than discouraging policies. So what are we learning from this? If you want students to perceive you as caring, competent, or trustworthy, and to report that you have a good rapport with students, your cell phone policy should be encouraging in tone. This does not mean that you have to allow unregulated cell phone use, but all of this research taken together indicates that teachers who use policies that are encouraging have better rapport with students. Now again, I want to take a little time out here and just because I know a lot of us are not education majors or instructors, we don't know a lot about the theory of education. But when you're trying to influence student affective behavior, one of the most important things you can do is develop a rapport with students. It's very, very important when trying to change student behavior that students feel good about their instructors. And so since we are trying to, as seminary teachers, change student behavior and not just fill their brains with facts, it's important for us to develop a rapport with students. And so if we want to be seen as an example or to be a source that a student can go to when they have a question or a struggle, then it's important for us to be perceived as caring, competent, trustworthy, right? And the tone of our cell phone policy has been shown through research to affect that. We may have a natural tendency to want to speak negatively, no cell phones in the classroom, no this, no that. But it's important that we use an encouraging tone, even if we're going to go ahead and ban cell phones. Now, I have two recommended policy types. The ones I recommend are positive permissive, which is a positive tone and permits use, or positive restrictive, which is a policy that has a positive tone and restricts use. Now look, you may not be a touchy-feely kind of person. You may be thinking, I'm my student's teacher, not their friend. Well, I myself have said, look, I don't need the approval of a 15-year-old. Someone has to be the heavy and I will do it. Well, that's one way of approaching things, but research shows that instructor-student rapport affects the measures that are most important to gospel teachers, and we need to pay extra close attention to how we're perceived by students. Here's the first point. The link between instructor rapport and student enrollment and attendance in on and offline classes is well established. Now, adapting this information to the gospel classroom, the way students feel about you as a teacher affects whether they come to class and whether they take similar classes. This may include future enrollment in institute or other courses. The work of Frisbee and Martin has shown that instructor rapport has the greatest effect on effective learning in the classroom. The greatest effect on effective learning in the classroom. They tested the relationship between instructor-student and student-to-student rapport in the classroom and found that, quote, instructor rapport consistently predicted participation, effective learning, and cognitive learning. Now, this important research shows that student perception of teacher rapport influences effective learning and classroom participation in classrooms more than student-to-student rapport. In other words, it's more important that students have good feelings toward their teachers than other students in order to experience positive changes in their effective learning, like changes in their motivation, in their feelings, their attitudes, values, and conscience development. It also means that if students have good feelings toward their instructors, they consistently Participate more. So if you are frustrated with the lack of participation in your classrooms, focus on building rapport with your students. Developing and encouraging cell phone policy is one small but proven way to build rapport with students. Now, you're going to make two decisions when you're making a cell phone policy. You're going to decide whether to ban or not to ban, and what kind of tone you're going to use when you deliver your cell phone policy. Well, you've heard me say that it's important to use an encouraging tone whether or not you choose to ban or not. So I'm calling that, right, an encouraging permissive policy or an encouraging restrictive policy. So encouraging permissive being a positive tone, but cell phones are allowed, or an encouraging restrictive policy where the tone is encouraging, but cell phones are banned. So let's talk about how to make that decision, whether to ban or not to ban.